All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going deep on Linux networking tools.
Yeah. We've got some really cool resources that lay out how these tools actually work, and more importantly, why they're so important.
Right, and how they can give you, the listener, an advantage when it comes to navigating networks.
Exactly.
Our mission, if you will, is to give you a shortcut to understanding these core concepts, particularly in the context of network interaction.
Yeah.
You know, how everything's kind of talking to each other.
Yeah, because these tools, they might seem basic at first glance,
Right.
but they really offer a deep dive into how networks actually function. We'll be exploring how to actually use Linux commands, both to see what's happening, but also to actually make changes.
Absolutely. So let's start with this tool called ifconfig.
Okay.
Think of ifconfig as like your basic network detective tool.
Yeah.
You pop open your Linux terminal, type in ifconfig, and it's going to give you a snapshot of all the active network interfaces on your machine.
Exactly. So you'll see things like ethaduro, which represents your wired connection.
Right.
You'll see low, which is your computer's way of talking to itself, the loopback interface.
Uh-huh.
And then, of course, for wireless, you'll see low LAN 0.
Right. And each one of those interfaces, each one of those connections has a hardware address.
Right. So you can think of this hardware address as a MAC address, and it's like a unique serial number for your network card.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then along with that, you've also got the INET address, which is your IP address. So that's like your address on the network.
Yeah.
And the bcast, which is your broadcast address. So that's used for broadcasting messages locally.
Right.
And then you have the network mask.
Yeah, the mask.
And the mask basically defines the boundaries of your local network.
Right. And then, like you mentioned, the loopback, it has an address of 127.0.0.1.
Yeah, so that's your computer talking to itself, essentially.
Right.
It's super useful for testing services that are running locally.
Right, so you don't have to go out to some external server. You can just test stuff locally.
Absolutely. And you don't need to even be connected to a network to use the loopback.
Exactly. And of course, for the Roland 0, you're going to see its specific MSC address as well.
Right.
This information, all of this that ifconfig is giving you, this is really your foundation for understanding how to connect to and manipulate local area networks.
Absolutely. And then moving on, we can talk about wireless specifically.
Yeah.
That's where iconfig comes in.
Okay.
And iconfig gives you detailed information about your wireless devices.
Gotcha.
And so this information is actually really relevant if you're looking at things like wireless hacking tools, right? So like air cracking, for example.
Oh, right. Okay.
Those tools use this kind of information. So if you run iconfig, you'll see things like the IDO2 key 111 all-one standards that your device supports. So maybe like B or G, you'll see the mode. So typically you'll see managed mode, which is like connecting to a regular Wi-Fi network. But there are other modes like monitor mode, which is also sometimes called promiscuous mode. And that's really important for things like password cracking because it allows you to see all of the traffic on the network, not just the traffic that's destined for your computer.
Oh, wow.
So it gives you a much wider view of what's happening. And you'll also see things like whether you're associated with an access point
Okay.
and the transmit power of your device. So that's all really useful information.
So it's like if config is the general overview, then iconfig really zooms in on the wireless stuff.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It gives you the nitty-gritty details.
Okay, cool. So we've kind of seen, the lay of the land here, but how can we actually interact with the network by changing these settings?
Okay, so being able to change your network information can be really important for various reasons. For example, if you're trying to connect to a network, you might need to change your IP address or your network mask to match the settings of that network.
Right, like to be seen as a trusted device on that network.
Exactly, yeah. And it can also be used for more advanced techniques like IP spoofing. So that's where you pretend to be a different computer on the network.
Right, that sounds like it's getting into kind of denial of service attack territory and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly.
So how do we change the IP address then?
Okay, so changing your IP address is actually pretty straightforward. You can use ifconfig again.
Okay.
So for example, let's say you want to change the IP address of your wired connection, which is eth0, to a specific IP address. You would just type ifconfig eth0 and then the new IP address.
Okay.
So you could use something like 192.168.181.115, for example.
Okay.
And then you can run ifconfig again, and you should see that the IP address has been updated.
Gotcha. So you're just kind of overwriting it, basically.
Exactly, yeah. And you can do the same thing for your network mask and your broadcast address. You just
Yeah.
use the net mask and broadcast options with ifconfig.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. And what about the MASI address? We were talking about that earlier, that hardware identifier. Can we change that?
Yeah, you can change the MASI address. It can be useful in certain situations, like, for example, if you're trying to bypass some kind of MAS address filtering on a network.
Right.
But you have to be careful because it can also cause problems if you're not careful. So to change your MAS address, you first need to take the interface down. So
Okay.
you would use ifconfig ifdao down, and then you can change the AMSI address using the command ifconfig ifdao ether, and then the new MASI address.
Okay.
So for example, you could use something like 00.11.22.33.44.55,
Got it. Yeah.
and then you need to bring the interface back up using ifconfig ifdao up, and again, you can use ifconfig to verify that the MAS address has been updated.
Okay, so you take it down, change the MAS address, bring it back up. Easy peasy. All right, well, what about getting a new IP address automatically?
Okay, so that's where DHCP comes in.
DHCP, yeah.
DHCP stands for Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, and it's basically a way for a server to automatically assign IP addresses to devices on a network.
Okay, so if you connect to a network and you don't have a static IP address, DHCP is going to hook you up.
Exactly, yeah. And so you can actually request a new IP address from a DHCP server using the dclient command.
Okay.
So you would use dclient and then the name of the interface. So for example, dclient eth0.
Okay.
And this basically sends out a broadcast message saying, hey, I need an IP address.
Right.
And then the DHCP server will respond with an offer, and then your computer will send a request to accept the offer.
Okay.
And then you'll get a new IP address.
And then we can run ifconfig again to see that new IP address.
Exactly, yeah. And just keep in mind that the IP address that you get might be different every time you connect to the network.
Right. Okay, cool.
So we've talked about the local network so far, but how do our computers find resources on the wider internet?
The vast, huge internet.
Exactly, yeah. So that's where the domain name system, or DNS, comes in.
DNS.
And DNS basically translates human-readable domain names, like Google.com, into numerical IP addresses that computers can understand.
Right.
So it's basically like a phone book for the internet.
Yeah.
And this information can actually be really valuable. For example, if you're doing reconnaissance, you might want to find out the IP addresses of a company's web servers or mail servers.
Right, yeah.
So to examine DNS, you can use a tool called DIG.
Okay.
And DIG stands for Domain Information Groper, which is a pretty cool name.
Yeah, that's a good one.
So, for example, you could use diggoogle.com, MASIS, to get the name servers for google.com.
Okay.
And name servers are basically the servers that are responsible for resolving domain names.
Gotcha.
So they're like the authoritative source for that information.
Right.
And you can also use diggoogle.com, MNX, to get the mail servers for google.com.
Okay, so NS for name servers, NS for mail servers.
Exactly.
Cool.
And just a quick note, BindD is a common DNS server software that's used on Linux systems.
Okay.
So you might come across that at some point.
All right. Now, let's say we want to use a different DNS server.
Okay.
Maybe for speed, maybe for reliability, or maybe for some other reason. How do we go about changing the DNS server that our system uses?
Okay, so you can actually change the DNS servers that your system uses by editing a file called @creasolve.conf.
Okay.
And it's a pretty simple file. You just add a line that says name server and then the IP address of the new DNS server.
Okay.
So for example, if you want to use Google's public DNS servers, you would add a line that says name server 8.8.8.8.
Okay.
And you can also do this from the command line. You can use echo name server 8.8.8 @creasolve.com.
Right, so just kind of redirecting that into the file.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
And one thing to keep in mind is that if you're using DHCP, your DHCP server might automatically update the @creasolve.conf file.
Right, so you might make the change and then it gets overwritten.
Exactly, yeah. So just be aware of that.
Okay, good to know.
And another thing is that you might want to keep the entries for your local DNS servers in the @creasolve.com file.
Right, so you can still resolve local host names.
Exactly.
Okay, very cool. Now, what about mapping our own IP addresses?
Okay, so there's a file called echosts.
Yeah.
And this file basically allows you to create custom mappings between domain names and IP addresses.
Okay.
So you can open up this file. You can use any text editor like LeafPad echosts, for example.
Okay.
And by default, it'll usually just have an entry for localhost,
Right, okay.
which maps the domain name localhost to the IP address 127.0 by 0 by 1.
Right. That loopback address again.
Exactly, yeah. But you can actually add your own entries to this file.
Okay.
So, for example, you could add an entry that maps the domain name bankofamerica.com to the IP address 192.168.181.131.
Okay, so if you type bankofamerica.com into your browser, it's going to go to 192.168.181.131 instead of the actual Bank of America website.
Exactly, yeah.
Gotcha.
And just a little tip, when you're adding entries to the echosts file, make sure to use a tab character to separate the IP address and the domain name.
Tab, not spaces.
Right, yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
And so this can be really useful for a lot of different things. Like, for example, if you're a web developer, you could use it to test your website on a local server before you deploy it to the live server.
Right. Yeah.
Or, for hackers, it can be used to redirect traffic to a malicious server.
Right. So if you get somebody to go to bankofamerica.com and they go to your server instead, you could potentially do some bad things.
Exactly, yeah. So there's a tool called dnspoof that can actually be used to automate this process.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it can be pretty powerful.
Wow. So we've covered a lot today. We talked about ifconfig, iconfig, changing IP and MS addresses, DHCP, and how to investigate and even manipulate DNS.
Yeah, that's a lot of ground we covered.
Yeah, these really are foundational skills that are going to help you to better understand networking and security.
Yeah, and they really give you the power to see and interact with the underlying infrastructure of the internet.
Right, not just be a passive user.
Exactly.
Now you can get in there and see how it all works.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, here's something to think about. Now that you've gotten a taste of how these networking tools operate, how might this new knowledge change the way that you think about the internet? You know, how you think about the devices that you use every day, what other unseen processes are constantly happening behind the scenes. That's something for you to consider.
Absolutely.
All right, thanks for joining us for this deep dive on Linux networking tools.
Yeah, thanks for listening.